The air in the conference room felt heavy that morning, like something bad was waiting to happen. Grant Hollis stood at the head of the glass table, holding my proposal folder like it was garbage. He tapped it twice, then slid it across to the investors with a smirk I'd never forget. "This," he said slowly, "is why you don't let assistants pretend to be strategists." The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel. I had spent 3 months on that campaign, working nights and weekends, perfecting every detail. When I opened my mouth to defend my work, he raised his hand. "You'll never be anything, Celeste. Some people are just meant to serve, not lead." Those words hit me harder than any punch could. That afternoon, HR escorted me out with a cardboard box containing my desk photos and coffee mug. As the elevator doors closed, I caught my reflection in the polished metal. My eyes were dry. I wasn't crying. I was planning. 2 weeks after losing my job, I received an email that changed everything. Grant had accidentally copied me on a message to the board. I stared at the screen, reading his words over and over. She was too emotional, too idealistic. Women like her break before they build. My hands shook as I printed the email. I folded it carefully and placed it in a small wooden box my mother had given me years ago. On a sticky note, I wrote, "Keep your receipts, Celeste." That night, I sat at my kitchen table and made myself a promise. I would never beg for a seat at another man's table again. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the beginning. I pulled out an old notebook and started sketching ideas. Business structures, brand names, revenue models. The seed of something bigger was already growing inside me. 6 months into unemployment, I was working late shifts at a bookstore cafe just to pay rent. One evening, an older woman overheard me explaining a marketing theory to a customer who'd asked about business books. She smiled at me from across the counter. "You think in frameworks, not slogans," she said. "That's rare." We talked for hours after my shift ended. Her name was Dr. Miriam Lennox, and she was a retired investor who had quietly backed several female-owned startups. When I told her my story about Grant and the humiliation, she didn't offer sympathy. Instead, she said something that stuck with me forever. "Then stop trying to get hired. Build something worth being fired from." She handed me a business card. Lennox Ventures. Private mentorship program. That night, I Googled her name. Her investment portfolio was worth nearly $600 million. She had built empires from nothing, and now she was offering to teach me how. For an entire year, Dr. Lennox trained me harder than anyone ever had. She never praised my work, only questioned it. One day, she asked me to present a business pitch in front of strangers she'd invited to her office. I thought I'd done well, but she tore it apart in front of everyone. I felt the old humiliation returning, the same feeling from that conference room with Grant. Afterward, when everyone had left, she said quietly, "You still let their voices echo in your head. Until you silence them, you'll never build your own." I walked home in tears that night, feeling like a failure all over again. But the next morning, something in me shifted. I returned to her office with a completely reworked plan, one that didn't imitate anyone else's style. It was mine. Raw, honest, different. For the first time since I'd known her, Dr. Lennox smiled. "You passed," she said. "Now, let's build something that will make him remember your name." 20 years passed like chapters in a book I was writing myself. Different suits, different confidence, different life. I stood in the lobby of Hollis and Crane Innovations, the same building I'd been escorted out of with a cardboard box. Only this time, I wasn't an assistant. I was Dr. Celeste Vale, founder and CEO of Arden Vale Holdings. The receptionist greeted me warmly, having no idea I'd once worked there. I was there for a corporate acquisition meeting. When I walked into the boardroom, Grant Hollis was already seated. He'd aged, heavier around the middle, gray at the temples, lines around his eyes. He didn't recognize me at first. When the board chair introduced me, Grant froze mid-handshake. The pen slipped from his fingers and clattered onto the table. He stared at me, his face going pale. "Grant," I said calmly, letting the silence stretch. Remember when you said I'd never be anything? His mouth opened, but no words came out. The boardroom hadn't changed much over 20 years. Same oak table. Same view of the city skyline. Even the faint smell of cedar cologne was the same. Grant sat across from me, trying hard not to look nervous. When he reached for his water glass, I noticed his cufflinks trembling slightly. "Our firm has been struggling," he began, his voice tight. I almost laughed but kept my face neutral. The company he'd once used to humiliate me was now drowning in debt and bad decisions. "I'm here to help," I said sweetly. "But I don't fix problems I didn't cause. I buy them." The silence that followed was so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. The board members shifted in their seats. Grant's lawyer whispered something in his ear. None of them understood, yet, that this wasn't the negotiation. This was my table now. I owned a room, and soon I would own everything else too. That evening, my lawyer slid the final acquisition documents across the polished table in my office. I reviewed every page carefully, especially the clause I'd added myself. It stated that the former CEO would remain as a 6-month transitional consultant under full supervision of the new owner. Grant had signed it without reading thoroughly. Ego makes people careless. When he handed me the pen back, he muttered, "Congratulations, Celeste." I met his gaze directly. "No, Grant. This is called accountability." The contract wasn't just about buying his company. It was about creating a moment where he would finally understand what it felt like to work under someone who didn't respect him. He thought I wanted the business and the profits. What I really wanted was the look on his face when he realized he now worked for me. That moment was worth more than any amount of money. Justice doesn't always come through courts. Sometimes it comes through contracts. When my new chief operating officer walked into the boardroom the next week, Grant went completely pale. "Meet Rowan Lennox," I said, gesturing to the tall man beside me. Dr. Miriam Lennox's son. The same family name Grant had quietly tried to blacklist 2 decades ago after a failed business partnership. Rowan smiled with that calm, controlled composure his mother had taught both of us. "My mother sends her regards," he said softly. Grant's jaw locked tight. He didn't know that Dr. Lennox had passed away 5 years earlier. But before she died, she'd left me something valuable beyond measure. A controlling stake in several of Grant's company patents that he thought were his alone. He'd mocked the wrong in turn 20 years ago. Now, her legacy and my patience had merged into his complete undoing. The board members watched this exchange with confused faces. They didn't understand the history. They didn't need to. They just needed to watch Grant realize he'd lost everything. 3 days later, my assistant forwarded me an email Grant had sent to the board members. The subject line read, "We need to remove her before she ruins us." He'd tried to rally them against me, not knowing that every person on that board had already signed loyalty contracts with my firm during the acquisition. The email was like watching someone dig their own grave while asking for a bigger shovel. At the next board meeting, I calmly projected his words onto the large screen at the front of the room. "You used to love humiliating people publicly," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I thought you'd appreciate the symmetry." Grant stared at the screen, watching his own betrayal reflected back at him in his own words. His face turned red, then white. "I made you," he hissed through clenched teeth. "No," I said softly, leaning forward. "You built the fire. I just learned how to walk through it without burning." 2 nights later, an alarm shattered the silence at 3 in the morning. I was still at the office, working late as always. The security system showed flames in the main server room. By the time I reached the building, firefighters were already there. The security footage told the whole story. One shadow, one lighter, one very familiar limp from an old sports injury. Grant. He'd tried to destroy the company's digital records, erasing files that documented years of fraud under his leadership. When the firefighters finally cleared the smoke and let me inside, I found one surviving hard drive in the corner. But it didn't matter. My IT team had backed up everything to a secure cloud system weeks before, anticipating something exactly like this. I stood in the ashes and whispered, "You taught me to be thorough, Grant." The next morning, Police arrested him at his home. But this wasn't the ending I'd expected. This was the beginning of something that would cut even deeper. The fire inspectors called me back to the building the following afternoon. "Dr. Vale," one of them said, holding something carefully, "we found something that didn't burn." Hidden behind the melted server racks was a small titanium safe, blackened but intact. Inside was a folder marked Project Halcyon, with my name scrawled across the top in red ink. My pulse slowed instead of quickened. I'd learned to stay calm in moments like this. Grant hadn't just tried to erase his crimes. He'd tried to erase me. The documents were from 20 years ago. Falsified budgets, embezzled funds, and one signature, forged in my name. The reason I'd been fired all those years ago wasn't because my proposal was bad. It was because I'd unknowingly stumbled too close to his cover-up. He'd destroyed my career to protect his secrets. But there was something else in that folder. Another signature that didn't belong to Grant. It belonged to someone I'd once trusted completely. I stared at that signature for over an hour before accepting what I was seeing. Dr. Miriam Lennox. My mentor. The woman who'd lifted me up and taught me everything. She'd signed one of the falsified contracts. It made no sense. Miriam had been good and honest. Why would she help Grant? Rowan walked into my office that evening and found me sitting in the dark, holding the document. "I was hoping you wouldn't find that," he said quietly. For the first time since I'd known him, his voice wavered with emotion. "My mother was blackmailed, Celeste. Grant held something over her. She signed those papers to protect someone." I swallowed hard, afraid to ask. "Who?" He hesitated, then met my eyes. "You." He threatened to destroy your future completely if she didn't cooperate. The room spun slightly. Everything I thought I knew was shifting. Miriam hadn't betrayed me. She'd sacrificed her own reputation to keep me safe. And I'd never known. In the bottom of the folder was an old photograph, edges yellowed with age. It showed a dinner party at Hollis and Crane from years ago. I was in the background, young and smiling, holding a wine glass. Across the table sat Grant, Dr. Miriam Lennox, and an older man I didn't recognize. The photo was dated 1 week before I'd been fired. When I flipped it over, I found a handwritten note in Miriam's distinctive script. "He's not who you think he is. Trust your instincts." That older man in the photo haunted me. His face seemed familiar somehow. I ran the image through a facial recognition search. The results made my hands go cold. The man was Charles Vale, my late father. He'd been a silent investor in Hollis and Crane before disappearing 23 years ago in what was ruled a plane accident. But if he was connected to the company, then maybe his death wasn't an accident at all. Maybe it was murder. Rowan and I spent 3 days combing through the recovered hard drive. Finally, we found a folder titled Legacy Shares buried deep in the system. Inside were confidential ledgers showing secret ownership stakes Grant had hidden under shell company names. One of them stopped my heart. See, Vale Holdings. My father had owned 27% of Hollis and Crane when he died. After his supposed accident, those shares were quietly absorbed into Grant's personal holdings through legal tricks and forged documents. That was why Miriam had protected me. She'd known the truth. I wasn't just some assistant Grant had fired. I was the rightful heir to a fortune he'd stolen. My humiliation 20 years ago hadn't been workplace cruelty. It had been calculated erasure by design. Grant hadn't fired me because I was unqualified. He'd fired me because I was entitled to everything he'd built on my father's stolen legacy. Now I understood why Miriam had trained me so carefully. She was preparing me to take back what was mine. The company's 50th anniversary gala was held at the Grand Bellamy Hotel, the same place where I'd once served coffee as an intern during corporate events. The irony felt surgical and perfect. Grant attended wearing a borrowed tuxedo, stripped of his CEO title, but still clinging to whatever pride remained. When the lights dimmed, I took the stage in a red dress that cost more than his monthly salary. "Tonight," I began, my voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "we honor 50 years of innovation, legacy, and truth." Behind me, a massive screen flickered to life. It displayed the forged documents, the hidden shares, and a large portrait of Charles Vale. The room froze. Then I said softly but clearly, "This company was built on a theft. I'm simply returning it to its rightful owner." The applause began slowly, cautious at first, then building to something thunderous. Grant stood motionless in the back, a ghost of his former arrogance. Then something unexpected happened. Just as the crowd's applause peaked, a security officer approached the stage carrying a sealed envelope. "Dr. Vale," he said urgently, "you need to see this immediately. It's about your father." Every camera in the room turned toward me. I opened the envelope under 100 watching eyes. Inside was a single sheet of aged paper. The handwriting made my breath catch. "If you're reading this, Celeste, then he's still alive." My knees almost gave way. Grant Hollis wasn't just a thief. He'd staged a death and let everyone believe my father was gone. The last line read, "Follow the trail in Zurich." Account number ending in 4312. It was my father's handwriting. I was certain of it. But something felt wrong. The ink looked too fresh. The paper too clean. Someone had written this recently, not decades ago. Someone wanted me to dig deeper. Or someone was setting a trap, and I was about to walk straight into it. 2 days later, I was on a plane to Zurich with Rowan beside me. Neither of us spoke much during the flight. We were both thinking about what we might find. The bank was discreet and elegant, the kind where wealth has no name, only codes and silence. The manager examined my identification carefully, then nodded slowly. "Dr. Vale, this account has been inactive for 20 years. But a secondary signatory reinstated access just last month." He slid a photograph across the polished counter. A man with gray hair and tinted glasses. The caption underneath read, "Charles Vale, account verified June 14th. My heart froze in my chest. My father wasn't dead. He'd been hiding all these years. Or someone had been pretending to be him. I needed to know which. "I need to see your surveillance footage from that day," I said. The manager hesitated, then agreed. What I saw on that screen changed everything I thought I understood. The surveillance footage was grainy, time-stamped 3 weeks earlier. A man entered the bank, walking with a slight limp, his face partly hidden by a hat. But when he reached the teller window, he turned slightly toward the camera. It wasn't my father. It was Grant Hollis. I felt cold from the inside out, like my blood had turned to ice. Grant had resurrected my father's identity, using the dormant account to launder company funds after the fire. The account was in my father's name, but the fingerprints and signatures were his. The fire, the forged papers, the fake letter at the gala. All of it had been an elaborate smokescreen. And I had just made him a public villain without realizing the game was far from over. Rowan put his hand on my shoulder. "Celeste, if you expose this too quickly, it could destroy the company. It might even make you look complicit in financial crimes you didn't commit." I stared at the frozen image on the screen. Grant's face, half hidden, still smirking. He thought he'd won again. I returned to New York and found my office completely ransacked. No alarms had been triggered. No security logs showed any breach. Only one thing was missing from my desk. The Project Halcyon folder. A handwritten note sat where the folder had been. Grant's handwriting. "You wanted everything. Now you'll have to survive it." I looked out over the Manhattan skyline. My company. My father's name. My entire life. Everything was hanging by a thread of lies and deceit that stretched back decades. And then, quietly, I smiled. Because I realized something Grant didn't know. I had already backed up every single document to 3 offshore servers before leaving for Zurich. I'd learned from watching him all those years ago. Always have a backup plan. Always keep receipts. Grant thought he was the puppeteer again, pulling strings and controlling the narrative. He didn't realize the strings had already been cut. Now I just needed to show him. 1 week later, Grant appeared on a popular business podcast. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim public sympathy and control his crumbling reputation. He called me a manipulative opportunist and accused me of falsifying inheritance records to steal his company. I watched the live stream from my office, taking notes. When the host said, "Would you like to address Dr. Vale directly?" Grant leaned forward with that old familiar smirk. That's when I called the studio. Patch me in, I told the producer.
Now.
The moment my face appeared on the split screen, Grant's smirk vanished. Hello, Grant, I said softly, calmly. Before you continue lying to these people, you might want to check your phone. He pulled it out, confused. His face drained of all color. Because on every screen in that studio, and on the live broadcast, the Zurich surveillance footage was playing. His face. His limp. His crimes. Millions of people were watching him get exposed in real time. The moment the footage aired, chaos erupted in the studio. Grant froze mid-sentence as federal agents entered through the back doors. He tried to run. Pure instinct, not strategy. But the cameras followed his every movement. The same cameras that once filmed him calling me incompetent now caught him in handcuffs. For 20 years, he had controlled every story, every narrative. Now the world was seeing the truth. His fraud. His theft. His lies. His cruelty. But I didn't celebrate or cheer. I just watched silently from my office window, remembering every night I'd gone home in silence, too tired and broken to defend myself. Justice didn't taste sweet like I'd imagined. It tasted clean, like breathing fresh air after a terrible storm. As the police car drove away with Grant inside, my phone buzzed. A reporter's question, Dr. Vale, what about the missing $80 million in his offshore accounts? I closed my eyes. This battle wasn't over yet. The next morning, financial newspapers exploded with new headlines. They screamed about missing money tied to Project Halcyon. $80 million that nobody could locate. Even though I'd exposed Grant's crimes, some reporters were now questioning my involvement. Rowan came into my office, his eyes hard with worry. Someone is planting these stories, he said. They're trying to make it look like you benefited from his crimes. I turned my computer screen toward him. An anonymous email was blinking in my inbox. You've only unearthed half the truth. The rest is buried with your father. Attached to the message was a location. Shiloh Harbor, Maine. The small coastal town where my father's plane had supposedly gone down 23 years ago. My hands trembled slightly as I read it again. Someone knew more than they were telling.
Someone wanted me to find something.
I'm going, I said. Rowan shook his head. Not alone. But I was already packing. Shiloh Harbor was quiet and cold, with wind slicing through the tall pine trees. The crash site had been cleared decades ago, but the locals still remembered everything. An old fisherman led me to a weathered house sitting alone on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. He stayed here for months, the man said, his voice rough from years of sea air. The one who survived the crash. I stared at him in disbelief. You saw my father? He nodded slowly. He said people were after him. Paid me good money to keep quiet. Inside the house, the air smelled like salt water and old wood. Dust covered everything. And then I saw it on the mantel. A framed photograph of me as a child, maybe 7 years old, smiling at the camera. Fresh flowers sat in front of it, recent and carefully arranged. My father hadn't just survived. He'd been alive all these years, watching me from a distance, unable to come home. I found a hidden compartment under the loose floorboards near the fireplace. Inside was a leather journal, worn and stained. My father's handwriting filled every page. The first line shattered my heart into pieces. If she's reading this, it means Grant has found me again. He detailed everything in careful notes. The secret partnership with Grant. The discovery of embezzlement. How Grant had tried to have him killed when he threatened to expose the fraud. He'd survived the plane crash, but lived in hiding to protect me and my mother from Grant's reach. The last entry was dated June 14th, the same date as the Zurich bank footage. That meant Grant had found him again after all these years. And this time, he'd made sure my father wouldn't survive. The fake account access wasn't just theft. It was Grant's final act of erasure, silencing the one witness who could destroy him completely. Taped to the back of the journal was a small USB drive with a label. Truth for Celeste. Do not trust Rowan. I stared at those words for a long time, my mind refusing to accept what they suggested. Rowan had been my right hand for years. Steady, loyal,
Kind.
but the files on the USB told a different story that made my stomach turn. They traced every major leak in the company back to one encrypted server. Rowan's personal system. He hadn't been protecting me at all. He'd been feeding carefully timed information to federal prosecutors, managing the investigation to save himself from indictment alongside Grant. When I confronted him back in New York, his usual calm shattered completely. "I did it to protect us both," he said, his voice desperate. "Grant would have taken me down too, if I hadn't cooperated." I smiled slowly, sadly. "You protected yourself, Rowan. That's all you ever did." He didn't know his confession was already being recorded. I'd learned that trick from Grant himself. In the final pages of my father's journal, one line stood out above everything else. The invention wasn't for profit. It was for healing. I opened the final encrypted file on the USB drive with shaking hands. It wasn't an embezzlement scheme like I'd feared. It was a complete design for renewable energy technology that could power entire cities at almost no cost. Grant and Rowan had hidden it for years, planning to sell the patent to foreign investors for billions. The missing $80 million weren't stolen funds. They were the seed money for a project that could have changed humanity's future. I sat there in the dark for hours, rain hammering against the windows. The storm outside matched the one raging inside me. For 20 years, I'd wanted revenge against Grant. Now, I wanted something more important. I wanted meaning. I wanted to finish what my father had started. I wanted to actually change the world, not just win a battle. The next morning, I walked into the boardroom where I'd been fired 2 decades earlier. The same glass table. The same portrait of Grant still hanging on the wall, smiling down like a king. Only this time, I owned 74% of the shares. When the chairman began the vote for company liquidation to avoid scandal, I raised my hand calmly. "I move for reinstatement," I said clearly. "Effective immediately, this company will relaunch under new direction.
Mine.
We're changing our name to Vale Industries." The room fell completely silent. I slid my father's renewable energy design onto the table. Every board member leaned forward to look. "This is what we were always meant to be," I said. "This is my father's real legacy. And I'm going to make it happen." After a long moment, the chairman called for a vote. The motion passed unanimously. History had just been rewritten by the woman they said would never amount to anything. As the board meeting ended, a federal agent approached me in the hallway. "Dr. Vale, we need to discuss your father's patent. You're not the only person claiming ownership." The claimant was a woman named Alara Montrose. She'd been my father's research assistant years ago. When we met at a cafe, she didn't look like a thief or a liar. She looked broken and tired. "He promised we'd change the world together," she whispered, holding a coffee cup with both hands. Then he vanished without a word. She handed me a letter written in my father's precise handwriting. "If something happens to me, trust Alara. She knows the rest of the story." For the first time in weeks, my certainty cracked. Had my father trusted her more than me? Or was this another puzzle, another test of what I'd become? Then I noticed something. Her copy of the design was slightly different from mine. It included an additional component my father had never mentioned. A failsafe device labeled Project Phoenix in small letters at the bottom. I worked through the night decoding the Project Phoenix schematic. It wasn't just a failsafe for the energy system. It was something far bigger. A hidden fund, still active after all these years, quietly collecting royalties from every small system my father had ever designed and licensed. Its current balance made me gasp out loud. $823 million. And the listed trustee made everything suddenly clear. Grant Hollis's wife, operating under an alias I'd never connected before. The same woman who'd once handed me my termination letter with a cold smile. It wasn't over. Not even close. I arranged one final meeting at her estate in Connecticut. She tried to play innocent, offering tea and small talk. "It's all ancient history, dear," she said sweetly. I placed the legal transfer papers on her polished desk. "History," I said, standing up, "is exactly what I study. And I'm very thorough." By morning, The funds would be transferred. My father's life work would finally come home. The sunrise over Halcyon Bay was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Alara stood beside me on the cliff where my father's plane had gone down. She held a sealed envelope he'd left with her years ago. "He wanted you to have this at the very end," she said softly, handing it to me. Inside was a note in his precise, careful handwriting. "You were never meant to destroy, Celeste. You were meant to build. The world doesn't change through revenge. It changes through restoration." I looked out at the horizon where the tide was pulling away the last traces of yesterday's storm. Behind me, the world I'd fought so hard to conquer was collapsing into silence. Lawsuits, media noise, the constant hum of power shifting between hands. But within me, there was only peace. I had rebuilt not just a company but myself. And as the sun climbed higher over Halcyon Bay, warming my face, I whispered into the wind, "I forgive you, Father. And I forgive myself." The past was finally gone. Now I could build the future. In reality, the people who laugh at your dreams are just afraid of what'll happen when they come true. If you felt that burn, that quiet rise from humiliation to light, hit subscribe and drop your thoughts below. And when you're ready for another story of calm strength and poetic justice, click the end screen. Your next story is waiting.